Welcome back. Today I'm going to work on checkmates in 4 and see if I can get any of those right. I don't have anything else by way of introduction except I've already done mates in 1s, mates in 2s, and a couple of videos on checkmates in 3. So let's see if I can do mates in 4. Okay, this is the first puzzle that is, the theme is mate in 4. Again, in a game, I would not assume that I had a checkmate here. It looks like I'm in trouble and I need to protect my king. It looks like we both have 2 rooks, and I have 2 minor pieces in exchange for a queen that I've lost at some point. So I definitely would not assume that I had a checkmating sequence here. But because it's a puzzle, we know that I do. I am not currently in check, so I can make a move that's not protecting my king from this queen. However, it looks like very quickly the opponent is going to start tearing me apart here and starting to be able to pick off my pieces. And I have, these pieces are undefended. The opponent can trade this off since I'm down in exchange. But I have to look for checks. One thing that is a possibility is something down this H file, because I do have an open H file. However, taking here with my rook is not a check, which would then leave this undefended, and that's checkmate. So I can eliminate rook captures h7 as my first move. I think I can eliminate pawn captures h7, g captures h7 as my first move. Even though it is a check, the king moves over and I don't have a follow-up, I don't think. I do think that I have something of a winning tactic there, because once the king moves over, the king would not be able to capture because of my rook, we know that. But once the king moves over, then it's trapped in the corner because my pawn is cutting off that square, g8, so the king couldn't come back if it had to. I think in that case I could capture this rook, which would be threatening mate here, if I'm not mistaken. Check. Only legal move is for the king to move over. Okay, then check. Rook captures d8, threatening to capture that rook for checkmate. Now if that rook captured back, I would then have mate here on f7 with my knight, because again that pawn on h7 is protected, so the king couldn't capture it. The pawn is guarding g8, so the king couldn't come back. But that's 3 moves to mate, and it's supposed to be a mate in 4. So check. King moves over. If I do capture that rook at that point, that's not a check. So that allows the opponent an intermediate move. And what would their intermediate move be? I think it would be a check on me. For example, capturing this pawn with check. And then I would have to move out of check, but then they could check me again, right? Wherever I moved out of check, they could check me again. And I wouldn't want to move out of check to the right, to the d file, because then when that rook captures, it's with check, and I'm in big trouble. So maybe rook capturing isn't the second move. Let's see. King moves over. Maybe it's knight captures f7 first, because then the only legal move would be for this rook to capture back. Then I capture this d rook with check, d8, and then the only legal move would be for their rook to return to f8, in which case I would capture it and that would be mate. And I know that's taken 5 minutes, but again, in a game I would not have seen a mate here, and even knowing that there's a mate in 4, it's difficult. But I am going to start with g captures h7. Okay. Now, we already determined that if I take this rook first, if they take back, that's mate. But I think if I take that rook first, they're going to throw in a check, possibly capturing this pawn with check. And then when I move out of check, they're going to be able to check me again. And I don't have a mate in 4 that way. So I think it has to be this, which removes the defender of the d rook. It's a forcing move. The only legal move would be for that rook to capture. Then I take the d rook with my d rook. Rook captures d8. They have to return here to block, and I take it, and that's mate. Wow. Okay. That was difficult. You can't see behind my camera view. There is a thumbs up and a thumbs down. I have learned that clicking the thumbs up is how you get to the next puzzle, and I'm not sure what clicking the thumbs down does, but anyway, that's what we're going to do. I'm going to go to my next mate in 4 puzzle. Okay, my queen is under threat by that rook that has just moved down, and that rook is protected by their queen, so I can't just take it. And we know that we have a mate in 4. Whereas in a game, I might be tempted to block with this rook, but then they would have the check on the back rank. And that would be very bad for me. Yeah, because then I would have to block with... I mean, if I blocked with the rook, then they would take it. If I blocked with the queen, they would take it. So that's probably, I would probably blunder this situation away in a game, especially blitz or faster. However, we know that we have a mate in 4, so let's look at checks. This check, I think, does nothing because the king would capture the queen. But I do know that many puzzles begin with a queen sacrifice, so I'm going to follow that through and not just assume it's lost because they captured my queen. If they captured my queen with their king, which isn't the only legal move, they would also have the option of moving. No, they would not have the option. That would be their only legal move, to take my queen. Then, of course, I would have this check on h2. I'm trying to learn the squares instead of saying this rook over here. Rook captures h2 check. But then the king would be up there, so it would not be able to capture the rook. So I think at that point the king's only legal move would be to come out to g5, where I could check with the pawn, and then the king's only legal move would be to go to f4, where I could then checkmate it with the other pawn, with pawn to g5 checkmate. That's a mate in 4, right? 1? No, sorry, queen is 1, rook is 2, pawn, pawn. That can't be it, can it? It was it. Oh, wow. And I solved that more quickly than I did the previous one. But it's only because I forced myself to follow out that queen sacrifice. So many times in a game and even in puzzles, I've said, oh, well, that just loses a queen. And then I move on to the next option. I was considering a rook sacrifice here first. And then when the king went back to take it, checking here. But I think then the king would have just moved over. So I followed that out and realized it would be checkmate. Amazing. Okay. Again, my queen is under threat from a protected rook. I'm guessing based on how many pieces are hanging here and how many different threats there are, that there's going to be a sacrifice involved. I am down an exchange, as we find out in so many puzzles. Our material is not equal due to me having a bishop instead of a rook. I am wondering if the first move of the puzzle isn't a bishop sacrifice on f2. The reason is, no, I don't think it is. I was thinking that the rook would capture and then I would take this rook with check, but then that rook would just return to block the check. So maybe it's not the bishop sacrifice. And just in case, let's check the queen sacrifices. There's 2 checks here with the queen, but I don't think either one of those wins anything. In the corner, h1, the king just captures. I think here on g2, the king would just capture, and even though I would have the follow-up check with my f-pawn, again, the king could just capture it, or the king could just retreat back to the square that it's on. So I don't think there's any good follow-ups to a queen sacrifice check. I also don't think there's a good follow-up to queen sacrifice here. Number one, that's not a check. But what would I have after they recaptured? Nothing, I think. I do know that this pawn is pinned because of my rook on g8. I wonder if that figures into it. I've noticed many puzzles depend on me spotting a pin. But yeah, I'm kind of at a loss here. I can get my queen out of trouble this way, but that doesn't threaten checkmate, does it? I don't think it does. And in that case, I think their response would be to capture this pawn with check. So yeah, I think in a game here, I would assume I was lost. I mean, I could retreat the queen to here, which protects my d-pawn and gets out of danger from that rook. But then what's the opponent's next move? Wouldn't they want to bring their next rook over to threaten my queen? But maybe if they did that, maybe I would have something over here. Could they stop that mate? Yes, because that pawn is pinned too. Their f-pawn and their g-pawn are pinned due to the bishop and the rook. So maybe if I move here with my queen to e6, I assume at that point they would want to threaten me with their other rook. Then I would go to h3, I almost said h6, h3, but then they would check me here, right? Sorry, I'm trying to keep the colors consistent. They would check me by capturing that pawn. And I would have to move out of check. That's 3 moves, and I don't have a mate on the following move, so I don't think that's it. Yeah. What is it? If I just do something like capture this pawn now, they're going to take my queen, right? Because, I mean, that's not a check. So they're going to take my queen, and they're going to be threatening my d-pawn. But then I would be able to capture here with discovered check from the rook. It would be a double check. Both the pawn on f2 would be checking, protected by the bishop, and the rook down here, which would force the king to the corner. And then I would have nothing. Then I would have nothing. Yeah, so that's probably not it because of this. There's nothing else I could do there, right? I mean, if I took this pawn, it would be a discovered check from the rook, but the king would just take it, I think. And then And then I wouldn't have a follow-up check with my bishop because the rook is sitting right there on d5. Okay, so I have no idea what the answer to this puzzle is. Not a clue. Even though I know I'm supposedly have a mate in 4, I have no idea what it is. This here, again, the rook doesn't have to capture. The king could recapture. If the king recaptured, I guess I could put my queen on c5 with check. But then the king has multiple options at that point, either those two or going back to where it was. Well, not that. No, it couldn't go back to where it was with my queen here. It would have to go to either f3 or g2. Good grief. Should I pause and think about this a while? I've paused it and thought about it. I have no idea. I'm just going to have to fail this puzzle and figure it out. And again, none of those moves seem better than any of the others to me. So there's probably something that I'm missing. But I don't see anything really threatening over here. I don't see what that does. Again, most of those moves, if getting my queen out of the way, I lose my d-pawn with check. And then I would have to figure out the safest square for my king, and I don't know that I would have a mate down there. I'm going to start with the bishop taking on f2, and that's probably wrong, but we'll find out. That was wrong, and I just lost 15 points of rating for that, which is fine. But as you saw in Lichess, when you get it wrong, it just pops the piece back to where it was and lets you try again. So was it taking the pawn? It was taking the pawn and losing the queen. Okay, that was one of the options we considered. We just didn't end up finding a mating sequence because I determined if I took that with the discovered double check, the king just moves out of the way, and then that pawn is stuck. I could go here. Oh, that's it, isn't it? Yeah. No, but that's not a check. That's not a check. Okay, well, I've already failed the puzzle, but no, that's not a forcing move. It does threaten the rook, but it's not a check. So is it this? Because that is a check, but the king can just capture back on h2 or hide behind it, right? This check forces the king in the corner, but again, then that pawn is stuck. Oh, maybe that is it. The king is in this corner, and then I check on g1. The king can't capture because the rook's protected by the pawn on f2, so the rook has to capture, and then I promote the pawn with a queen. Okay. And that's mate because the bishop protecting it. Wow, wow, wow. That was something else. Let's go back to the beginning. Can I do that? Okay, that is the correct puzzle. All right. Oh, it's taken me out of the theme, so I'm going to have to navigate back into the mate in 4 section. But it was the bishop sacrifice and a queen sacrifice. And or the queen sacrifice. I'm basically giving them an option of which piece to take. Right? No, it was the pawns here sacrificing the queen. Wait, I've already forgotten. No, the bishop had to stay there. Okay, so it was the pawn. Capturing with the pawn. Letting them have my queen. Discovered double check. Then sacrificing in there to checkmate with the queen. Okay. And then... Okay. I had opened that in a new tab, so I just went back to the previous tab to stay in the Mate in 1 themes. I'm going to click Next. And even though I'm already at about 20 minutes, I should at least do one more here. Wait, it says now that I've only got none right. I got the first one, didn't I? Okay. No, I got the first 2. Wow. It usually keeps track of those down here at the bottom, but it did not this time. Maybe it's counting this as a new session. Okay. Mate in 4. I have a check here on b2 which threatens to win the rook, which is probably what I would be thinking of in a game here because it's a fork. Do I have any other checks? Oh, I was going to say I have a check there, but no, the knight, the enemy's knight is guarding that spot. Those are 2 checks that I have. Any other checks? My knight can't check from here. My bishop is not going anywhere at the moment. I am pretty sure it's not giving up the queen for a knight. Well, no, it would just be giving up the queen for free because I wouldn't then take back with my rook. So it's probably that, although I also have a check here. I have checks on b2, I have check on b4, I have a check on a5. One of those is apparently better than the others. I think it might be important to keep in mind that my rook is guarding all those squares. My rook is preventing the king from moving to any of those squares. My king is preventing the king from moving to any of those squares across here due to the opposition. And if my queen were on b2, it would be cutting off these squares, which would force the king to d1. And then I wouldn't quite have a mate yet. Sorry, had to pause it. I had a phone call. Okay. If I checked on b2, the king would be forced to d1. And then would I have a follow-up from there? I would not. Because if I came back, their pawn could capture. If I went forward, obviously the king could capture. If I went over to c2, the king could capture. But yeah, I think it is important to keep in mind how many of the squares are cut off from the king. But yeah, if I go to b2, the king goes here, and I don't think I have a good follow-up at that point, because that would be the only legal move for the king then. So maybe it's not b2, maybe it's b4. That gives the king more options. It could still go. It could still go to d1, but then because of where my rook is, I would be able to check down here and force the king up. But I could also check there, and then I'm not seeing the mate. I am seeing that that's hanging. I'm seeing that there's a tactic here where there's a check, and when I take the bishop, they win my rook. And I'm already down on material. The only advantage I have is that the opponent's got 4 pieces that haven't gotten off their home squares yet. Those 2 rooks are out of the game. But go back to this. That forces the king back to the back rank. Oh, I could just take the knight. Oh my goodness, I missed that. Okay, so I check there. The king goes to the back rank. Then I check. No, I can't take the knight because the rook's guarding it. What? I almost didn't even consider this check, but my king is protecting that square. Okay, that's important. That forces the king there. I think queen to d3 check might be it, because it is protected by my king. None of the opponent's pieces are guarding that square. My rook continues to cut off this side. My queen, of course, at that point would be cutting off all of these squares. So the king would be forced to c1 at that point. Then I could follow up with rook to e1, which would force the king to b2. Where I would be able to follow up, check, That would be mate. No, it would not be mate because of their knight. Okay, well, their knight and their rook. Why do I... Oh, my goodness. It doesn't matter that they're still on their home squares if they're still protecting everything down there. Okay, but yes, that's very forcing. Forces the king here. Then I still think that's best, but that forces the king here. But I have to watch the squares that their knight is guarding. Their knight is protecting those two dark squares there, c3 and d2. I would have... And this knight over, their left knight is guarding e2, so I wouldn't be able to pull my rook back up at that point. I mean, I could... It's forcing... And yeah, I've got to watch out for their pieces covering these squares over here. But that's the only legal move. And then is the rook down there the best if the king can just escape to b2 and I can't do anything about it? Maybe at that point it would be best to continue checking with the queen. But no, but then the king has two options. Okay, now if it came up to c2, then I could check with the knight and bring my knight into the game. And we'd be getting close. And if it went over to d1, I could check there, but then it would be forced here, and then I could check with my knight. So maybe that's it. Let's try that. Okay. Again, that was the only legal move. We knew it had to go there. And the problem with bringing the rook down is that the king can go here and I can't follow-up check safely, I don't think. Because their knight's guarding this square, this knight's guarding this square and this one. So yeah, I'm thinking about checking on e3 with the queen, and if the king comes to the d1 square, then I will check there, forcing the king here where my knight can check it. If I check on e3 and the king moves here to c2, then I could check with my knight. But what if it moved? What if it went to b2 at that point? Maybe the rook is the best. But still, then what do I do when the king goes to b2? Because the king's going to b2. There's nothing I can do about that. I don't think there's anything I can do about that. I would be able to bring the queen back here, and then the king has all sorts of legal moves. I'm going to try it. It's been too long. Oh, that was it. And the king did go there. Okay. Well, again, we know I can't follow up check here or here because of their knight. I mean, I could, but I don't think I'm going to have a shot at this mate without my queen. And their pawn guards that square, and their king will capture over there. Actually, their king would take on either one of those two squares. So this is the only check left to me, besides taking the knight, which I think would lose to the rook. And this, remember, loses to their other knight. So it's not one of those. And my pesky king is in the way of this check. So I think it has to be back to b5. Nope, that wasn't it. Okay, well, whatever on earth was it then? Was it now bringing the knight? No. Was it advancing the pawn? No. Well, I don't know it is. Wasn't sacrificing the queen. It was sacrificing the rook. Because the knight was guarding that square and that's mate. Oh my goodness. That was way too hard. Okay. So this was the first move. And that was the second move. But then I have to get the knight away from guarding c3. Okay. Well, thank you for any of those of you who stuck with me through. I thought I solved 2 puzzles first and then failed 2. But the little counter here under the board says it looks like I got one and that's it. But I know I failed one. Okay, I don't know what happened to the counter. But anyway, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.